Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be walking you through my watercolor process from start to finish. So if you've ever wanted to get into watercolor or wanted to know how to maybe paint skin or hair in watercolor, didn't quite know where to start, this video is for you because I am going to be taking you through every single step with some real-time footage to show you exactly how I came up with this piece. I also wanted to mention that this original painting as well as prints of this painting are for sale on my Etsy. I recently revamped my whole Etsy, so there's a lot of new stuff on there, so I'd really appreciate it if you guys would check it out. Okay, so let's get right into the painting. Before I started anything with this piece, I wanted to establish some sort of background, and I like to do this because I find that if I don't establish something in the background, my colors and values always turn out a bit off by the time that I do get to the background. So I like to establish maybe just a color or a texture, just some kind of like jumping off point before I get into the rest of the painting. For this one, I wanted to have kind of like a watery texture background that had a lot of muted grays and blues and purples because I wanted this to look like an underwater scene. Another thing that it's important to keep in mind when you're working with watercolor is that watercolor can have such a fun texture to it. I notice a lot of people get stressed out about watercolor because it's a little hard to control, and I can understand that, but if you think about watercolor in the way that the unpredictability of it is actually a benefit, you'll have more fun with it. So don't freak out about if there is some splotchiness or maybe some unpredictable textures. Just find a way to work that into the rest of the piece and you'll have more fun with it. Anyway, so I am now getting into the skin, and I actually messed up a little bit here. When you are painting larger pieces of the same color, it's a good idea to use a bigger paintbrush than the one I am currently using. If you are trying to get a solid color and a solid wash, it's easier if you have a lot of paint, a lot of water on your brush, and also a large brush to do it with. It turned out alright for the skin because I ended up fixing it, but you can kind of see where some of the color overlaps in a way that's not exactly flat. But that just also goes back to the whole unpredictability of watercolors. You just kind of gotta roll with it. But yeah, so I colored in the skin in one solid color for now. I chose a peachy-ish skin tone, and like I mentioned earlier, you want to have a lot of the paint on your brush as well as a lot of water. If you don't have enough water or paint on your brush, it will end up being more streaky than you might like. So now I am putting in flat colors for the hair, and this is a little hard to explain. I'm going to try my best, but I do not like to color the hair in one flat color like I do with the skin. Instead, I kind of paint the hair in chunks, and this just makes it easier for me because when I go back and add value, I've kind of already established which parts of the hair are going to be darker or lighter. And the way I do this is when you're painting with watercolor, the more water you have in your palette, the lighter the color is going to be, the more washed out it's going to be. But if you have more of the paint, more of the pigment in your palette, it's going to be a brighter, more vibrant color. So what I do is I alternate how much water is in my palette, how much paint is in my palette, to establish which parts of the hair I want to be darker and which parts I want to be lighter. Now, this comes with just playing around with watercolor. The more you use watercolor, the more this will make sense to you. But basically, I just kind of paint the hair in different chunks. I don't know how else to describe it, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. You see some parts are really light, some places are really dark, and it does not quite look great right now, but that's only because I'm establishing different values. I will go in later, you will see, and I will make it look more cohesive and make it look more like hair, but for now I'm just trying to plan out in my mind which parts of the hair I want to be dark and which parts I want to be light. If you color all of the hair one value, I find that it looks a bit flat. When you have alternating values of darks and lights and midtones, it makes the hair look more believable, especially with watercolor. So yeah, that's kind of how I start the hair, and I do that throughout the rest of the hair as well. And then you'll also see me go in with a smaller paintbrush. I'm just adding details. It's something I like to do in my paintings with hair. I really like to add just like little loops and little swirlies of different hair just for more detail, and I think it adds a little bit more personality as well. So now you'll see that I just repeated that process for the rest of the hair, and don't be intimidated by the darks and lights that I'm talking about. This also comes naturally when you draw a lot of hair, and the more hair that you draw, the more you'll notice which parts should be darker, which parts should be lighter, which parts should be in shadow. So if you're struggling a bit with this, don't worry. I just suggest practice drawing more hair and drawing hair from reference as well. Now what I'm doing is I'm going back in with my watercolor and starting to establish value. I don't like to use black when I'm using watercolors. I like to keep my colors relatively lighter and pastel. So instead what I'll do is I'll have my skin tone, and instead to make the color look darker, I will mix in some purples or blues into the skin tone to kind of establish a darker value. What I like to do is I like to add darker spots around the eyes and the nose and the mouth. I don't create too much value here with the watercolors. I like to go in with color pencils, which I will show you guys a bit later. But I do like to have some kind of differentiation with the watercolor. I don't want my watercolors to be too flat, so I like to just establish some parts that I think that should be darker. Again, this will make more sense to you the more that you draw, the more that you paint, the more faces that you draw. You will kind of know which places should be darker and lighter, but like I mentioned, I like to make the eyes dark. I like to add a lot of emphasis to the eyes, so I like to add most of my contrast around the eyes area. Also, I like to add a little bit of shading to the nose so that it doesn't look so flat, and to the lips as well. I keep the cheeks relatively simple and flat. I don't really add too much color except maybe some red to the cheeks to add like a little bit of blush. But that's about it. And this is really a layering process. You have to be really patient. I like to let each layer dry before I start adding more colors, so it's kind of a waiting game, and I understand that can be a little frustrating, especially to people who are used to working with like a dry media. So I suggest just taking your time with this step. Take your time, don't rush, and just enjoy painting. Also, going back to the whole texture thing, you may find that your skin tone will not be totally even. That is totally okay. Your skin tone, or any color really in your watercolor pieces, they don't have to be totally smooth and even. And I know a lot of people get frustrated with this, especially if they're used to working with like color pencils or Copic markers where you can get easy flat colors. But try to get out of that mindset when working with watercolor, because it's not easy to achieve, and I personally think one of the benefits of watercolor is having those textures, those fun, interesting textures that just kind of happen naturally while you're painting. So try not to be caught by those feelings of, oh no, my skin tone isn't flat, or this looks splotchy. Just kind of roll with it and learn to incorporate it and make it work for you. That is ultimately what I end up doing. Also, you will see, again, as I keep mentioning, I go back with color pencils. Once I do that, it's also kind of easier to smooth out some of those splotchy pieces in places that you want. So we will go back and fix some of those spots, and I will show you guys that once we get to the color pencil portion. But for now, just have fun. Keep adding different colors. Like I mentioned, I really like to use purples in my skin tones, so I like to add a lot of like blues and purples, especially around the eyes, but don't be afraid to play around with different colors as well. Maybe try adding some yellow to the highlights or some blues to the shadows. Just experiment with different colors and different color palettes until you find something that ultimately ends up working for you. When I watercolor, especially when I'm coloring the skin, a technique I like to use is I will often take the pigment onto my brush and lay it down where I want to put it. So say I want to add some purple beneath the eyes. What I will do is I will lay down that color and then wait a little bit for the color to kind of sink into the paper, and then I will go back in with a clean brush with just water in it, and I will kind of try to drag the pigment outward to create almost like a gradient effect. It's a little hard to explain, so I hope you guys kind of understand what I'm saying, but you'll notice I do it a lot with the skin. This kind of helps combat the splotchiness issue that often comes up with watercolor. So if you want to create maybe more of like a smooth gradient, maybe something not as textured, I would suggest playing around with that technique. And it's basically just mixing, using the pure pigment on your brush and then using water to kind of spread it where you want it to go. So from here on out, it's basically just a process of layering different colors until I have the desired effect that I want. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of just being patient and waiting for those layers to dry. I like to add lots of different layers because the more layers you add, the more those colors are just going to lay on top of each other and mold together. And I just think that with watercolors especially, layering is very, very important. But like I mentioned, it is a game of just being patient. So take your time, be kind to yourself during this stage. It's going to look rough. This is the roughest stage for me personally, as you can tell. It doesn't quite look right, but this is a very, very important step. And it's important that you don't skip this step, even if it ends up looking maybe not quite as you hoped it would. This is definitely that awkward stage in the painting. Every painting goes through an awkward stage, and this is it, for my process at least. But just keep adding colors until you're happy with where your colors and values are. This is actually my favorite part of my watercolor process. So once I'm happy with all of my colors, all of my values, I then go in with some color pencils, and here's where I really define shapes and lines. I like to go in with a brownish reddish color pencil for most of my works. Of course, this also depends on the painting that I'm doing. I will pick whatever colors, of course, match best for the piece. But for the most part, I like to use dark browns and dark reds for the skin tones. And I just define, like, I define the lines that I want to stick out mostly. This includes the eyes, the eye shape. I also like to go in and do some really subtle shading with the color pencils as well. I find that this just really makes everything pop in a way that I just can't get with pure watercolor. And I like to use a couple different shades too, not just one color pencil for everything, but I like to use maybe 2 or 3 different colors for like the skin, and then I use a whole bunch more for the hair, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. So I like to shade around the eyes and the nose and the mouth especially, basically wherever I want to add maybe a pop of drama or a bit of contrast. And I just like to play around with the different colors and the different shapes, and I just kind of let myself go crazy with this step. I find it really fun and really relaxing, and I really, really love the effect that it gives off too. So like I mentioned, I'm just going in and defining those areas. I will make some places much darker than the rest, like the nostrils and around the eyes, underneath the lips, to establish more value. Something that I struggle with watercolor especially is getting dark values, so using the color pencils is also great for that because I can get those dark colors that I can't get just with the watercolors. I also like to add some red tones as well. I think this just adds just a little something. I like to add a little bit of red around the nose, underneath the eyes. I think it just ends up looking really cute. I also shade the lips with the color pencils as well. I kind of like to use the same browns and pinks even for the lips, just to keep everything looking more cohesive. And it's much easier to add value in smaller places when you're using color pencils as well, for obvious reasons. Okay, now we are getting into the hair. I am going to do my absolute best to explain my process for this, so please be patient with me. So what I do, I already have a lot of my values already established with the watercolor, so I am going in and adding strands and details with my color pencils. Basically, how I do this is I am following the flow of the hair, the shape of the hair, and just making lines to kind of follow those curves and those shapes. I'm using quite a few different colors for this, and I am keeping in mind those values that I already established when doing this. So I will use like a lighter yellow for those lighter parts, and then a darker orange for the parts I want to be more shady. And yeah, this is also really just a process of trial and error, figuring out kind of what works, what doesn't, and just kind of having fun with it. I like to just go wild with these shapes and these lines. I like to spend a lot of time defining these strands of hair. It is one of my absolute most favorite things to draw in the world is hair. So I really just kind of let myself go crazy and have fun with it. I like to add lots of different strands, lots of different little details. I like to alternate my colors a lot just to add just to make it look more visually appealing. And like I mentioned, I'm just following these shapes, these chunks that I already defined earlier. I just follow those with the color pencils with the different colors until I get an effect that I really, really like. I will also establish more value as well. You can kind of see me doing that right here by making some places darker, some places lighter, just creating more depth within the hair, within the chunks and the shapes. This will get easier the more that you draw. Like I mentioned before, I suggest drawing lots of hair, looking at lots of hair references, and honestly, just not taking it too seriously and just having fun. I like to really just let myself go wild with this stage. It is a process though, and it does take quite a long time. I think this step took me at least an hour and a half by itself. So it is a very long process, but I believe it is definitely worth it. I also go back in with my watercolors if I feel like a piece of hair is maybe too light, not pigmented enough, or if I want to just define some more spaces. I kind of alternate with the watercolors and the pencils. So don't think that you have to be like stuck in one step. You can alternate your materials at any point in any of this process. So if you feel like you want to add more color to somewhere, go ahead and do it with the watercolors. You don't need to be like, okay, I'm done with the watercolors, now I'm doing pencils. Don't feel like you have to be defined by those steps. You can alternate whichever material you're using if you feel like you need to use one material over the other to just establish either colors or values or basically anything you want. And you'll notice the more that I go in with the hair, the more I will alternate and define those spaces and maybe make some places more orange, make some places darker. It's really just alternating my materials until I get something that I'm happy with. Now I'm going in and just adding the finishing touches to the painting. I'm almost done, so now what I'm doing is I'm looking at the piece overall and I'm thinking to myself, what more can I do to push this piece to make it the best it can possibly be? What I ended up doing was I made the eyes a little bit darker, made them stand out just a little bit more, added more contrast, and I also went in and added a lot of orange to the hair to make the hair just more colorful. I really wanted her hair to be like bright, bright orange. So I ended up going in and adding more pigment to the hair as well. And this step will definitely change depending on what your goal is for the piece. I kind of take this time to reflect on the piece overall, like what's working, what isn't working, what can I do to make it better? And I just kind of reflect on that, and then I make whatever changes I feel are necessary to just make the piece feel finished in my eyes. This is often the hardest step for me as well, because I find it hard to accept when a piece is done. It's hard for me to be like, okay, I've done all I can for this piece and now I'm done with it. So take this time to really think about what goal you want for this piece, what you want it to accomplish, and then decide if you are in a place where you can call it finished or not. And sometimes that may also mean not being totally happy with the piece and being like, okay, I've done all I can for this piece and it didn't turn out how I wanted, but I just need to be done with it. this, like I said, this can often be the most challenging step because it's really hard to call a piece done or know when to walk away from a piece. But that also will come in time. All in all, I'm very happy with how this one came out. I'm very pleased with it, and I hope you guys like it as well. We're pretty much finishing up now with this video. The very last step, of course, is I add some details with my white gel pen. I like to add details to the nose and to the eyes just to make everything look a bit more sparkly and kind of make it pop just a little bit more. But with that being said, that's pretty much the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it helped you with your watercolor processes. I hope it was easy enough to follow. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments below and I will do my best to help you. And yeah, if you do use this video and maybe make some watercolor pieces, feel free to tag me in social media so I can see what you guys come up with. I love it when you guys show me your work. It is like my favorite thing ever. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. I hope you guys go out and make beautiful paintings, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye guys.